Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? Let's talk about Dan Brown and his books. People who are getting into reading for leisure and whatever these days might not appreciate just how ever present Dan Brown's books were around 20 years ago. And it's funny looking back at the year 2005 and how cyclical history can be. In 2005, Barca won La Liga and there was a conclave in Europe. In 2025, Barca wins La Liga, and there's another conclave over in Europe. Kind of gross with Amazon Prime how quickly they made that conclave movie from last year free on Prime and started pushing it like right after the Pope died. Anyway, I was still on my mission in Spain in the spring of 2005, and it was kind of interesting to be over there when there was more proximity to conclave and see people's interest in it. Being in Spain, they had their ear to the ground, but it wasn't like it was happening in the backyard. It was still over in Vatican City and everything. But right around that same time, Dan Brown's books were getting extremely popular. And while I wasn't reading things for leisure over there, like going into the mission, you don't really read, popular fiction for literature. You don't go to the movies, that kind of thing. It's kind of like going into a cultural submarine for 2 years and just focusing on studying and preaching the gospel. I started my mission in September of 2003, and it wasn't until the fall of '05 that I got to see Return of the King or any of the movies that I'd missed in that time. It's just how it is. But as we were walking along the street shops and stuff, and bookstores were still a thing, and I saw these titles that kept popping up everywhere: Ángeles y Demonios and El Código da Vinci, along with books in Dan Brown's backlog. The Da Vinci Code really took off, and as it often happens with authors who have already published a couple of things, once they have a really successful book, then their backlist becomes successful because people want to read other things by them. And so I can't remember the title for Digital Fortress in Spanish. I think it's just Fortaleza Digital. That is a terrible book. And then Deception Point, which came out between Digital Fortress and the Da Vinci books, or the Langdon books, was called La Conspiración, just The Conspiracy. I don't think Deception Point really translated. Anyway, I saw those books popping up all over the place, and after I got home, I decided to look them up and read them. They were, like I said, tremendously popular, and now looking back at them, they're kind of like the 50 Shades of Grey of academic, historic, religious thriller literature. Everybody read them, but they also kind of acknowledged that it was silly, but it was engaging. People were intrigued to some extent. I read Angels and Demons first because I was given to understand that it was chronologically the first, even if the movies came out in reverse order. Because Da Vinci Code was more successful, they did Da Vinci Code as the movie first in line. But anyway, I thought Angels and Demons was fascinating plot-wise because it was all about some conspiracy to mess with the conclave. That was my first introduction into the behind-the-scenes of conclave, and I think that it was the same way for a lot of people. They understood generally, especially for people like me who aren't Catholic, that it was the process by which a new pope was elected, but they didn't know all the history of it or the fact that all the cardinals literally locked themselves into the room, like conclave, like locked with a key, or as the movie depicts it, with a seal. For the Catholics, for the practicing Catholics of the world, this was a very kind of sacred and holy process. And so there was also a bit of subversiveness to writing this into a novel, a fictionalized form, especially when part of that process involves somebody kidnapping the top 4 cardinals that are likely to be elected to the next pope, and the cardinals inside the conclave trying to stall for as long as they can by constantly putting up a fake vote until the other 4 cardinals are saved and retrieved and stuff. It was a peek behind the curtain from an otherwise, I don't know if secretive is the right word for it, but so much as guarded process. In addition, there was also some talk of different historical sites in Rome and in Vatican City, and it's kind of a hallmark of these Langdon books that you get long treatises on history, and like, this is the history of this building and that building and whatever. Dan Brown's prose is terrible, and I've heard from people who know more about this stuff than I do, his historical information is also often wrong and depicted poorly. But if you're more of a layperson like I was when I read these books, like, you don't know that. You're at least able to wrap your head around what he's presenting, and for better or worse, often worse, you walk away from this book feeling like you learned something and got to experience a cheap thriller at the same time, if you can muscle your way through Dan Brown's like really bad writing. But that's what made those books exciting at the time. Like, okay, cool, he's being a little edgy about religious subjects. With Angels and Demons, it's like, hey, let's do a thriller about Conclave. With Da Vinci Code, let's do a thriller about whether Jesus Christ actually had a wife and a daughter, and if the bloodline of the Son of God continues to this day. Like, if you're not a practicing Christian, that could be, an eyebrow-raising concept for a story. If you are a practicing Christian, there's almost this perverse curiosity of like, I'm not going to buy this at face value, but I'm curious to see what he has to say about it. He can get your interest, which speaks to the strength of the concept and, to a lesser degree, the execution. We can make fun of his sloppy execution as much as we want, but nevertheless, a significant number of people read those books, myself among them. There was not necessarily diminishing returns so much as diminishing tolerance of the flaws of his books as the series carried on. I think he's written 5 Robert Langdon books now. I read 4 of them. I read The Lost Symbol when that came out in 2009. There was still plenty of hype around that character in that series and that writing. I gave that book 3 stars, but there was still a lot to recommend it. I thought the exploration of George Washington's role as a Mason and what it meant for the construction of certain sites around DC, and kind of like a mixing of the Da Vinci Code-ness of it all, as well as with a lot of elements that made National Treasure really interesting. Something for us American history addicts to sink our teeth into. And Langdon himself had to go through a character arc. He's a committed, I don't know if necessarily like atheist is the right term, or if he's just agnostic, but he's committed to being so open-minded that he doesn't tie himself to religion by any stretch. But even that personal commitment was challenged. And it isn't to say that it's a story about an agnostic guy, gaining a testimony of Christ or whatever, but writing about a character, no matter what their convictions are, being challenged and coming to a conclusion that they might be more open about, makes for a good development and all of that. I also remember getting to like the real end of the thrill and drama of that series, or excuse me, of that book, when the audiobook had come out and I was listening to it. I was like, oh cool, it should be wrapping up soon. And I checked it and I had 2 hours left. What is still going to happen in this book? That's one of Brown's flaws. He does tend to overwrite the heck out of everything. Another 4 years later, the 4th book came out called Inferno. And he does a gimmick that I absolutely hate, where a character has amnesia, especially when you get deep into a developed series. Like, amnesia is just the writer confessing that he's out of ideas. And it was all tied into clues that Dante Alighieri left in the Divine Comedy. And Langdon's got to go around Europe trying to get his memories back, as well as figure out what a bioterrorist is doing with a virus that's going to sterilize the world. Like, oh, the world's overpopulated. It's like, all right, cool, whatever. I got to the end of that one, and it was too much of the same of what he'd done previously, and it was done poorly. So much so that I didn't bother with the 5th one. I can't even remember what it was called. He did another one years later. I'm like, yeah, I think I'm going to tap out of this. I'm going to make 2 recommendations here, though. If you've never read a Dan Brown book, I would say don't bother with the Robert Langdon books. I think out of the Langdon books, Angels and Demons was probably the most exciting. And I can't speak to the historical accuracy of it all, but I think out of all the ones that I've read, that one's probably my favorite. But if you are going to read a Dan Brown book, do check out Deception Point. For all of its flaws, I think that was the best concept and the best execution. The premise is that NASA finds a meteor underneath, I believe it was the Arctic, that has fossils in it. The implication being that they finally have hard, tangible proof of life on other planets. But there's a twist involved in that, and it's got less to do with like examining a different angle of history and religion and philosophy and literature and stuff, and more of like, here's some scientific tech that could do this that nobody's thought about. Whatever flaws that his prose has, I think he's much better when he's messing with science than when he's messing with history. Although his 1998 thriller, Digital Fortress, was just a downright travesty. Like, even when I was at my least critical and my most patient with books, I read that one. I was like, this really sucks. And if you're familiar with the 372 Pages podcast, this is the other recommendation I'm going to make. That was one of the earlier books that they reviewed several years ago. I want to say it was maybe 2020. You'll want to look for the episodes in like the 70 to 80 range. Mike and Connor had a field day with it. That podcast is Mike Nelson from MST3K and Riff Tracks doing books instead of movies. And that particular book and that series of reviews was some of their best work. It was just hilarious. And if you're worried about being mean to a writer's book, Dan Brown himself has made fun of this book in other books that he has written. So don't worry about it. Just have fun with it. So check out those episodes of the 372 Pages podcast. And like I said, if you're going to read a Dan Brown book, I think Deception Point is his sleeper, and it would probably make the best movie out of any of his work that's been adapted. I've seen 2 of those Tom Hanks movies. I think they made one more. Didn't bother with it. But that's why Dan Brown was successful. He was able to show people a thriller that was centered on things that, well, I mean, in theory, were accurate portrayals and analyses or whatever of history. It was a bit of like a modern day Indiana Jones thing, only the Indiana Jones character wasn't a fighter of any kind, really. He was a guy who teaches symbology at Harvard. It's all very, like I said, it's all pseudo intellectual and silly, but it's entertaining, and it's hard to argue with something that strikes a chord with that number of readers. Even if we look back on it the way your parents look at disco and pretend that they didn't really partake at the time. We were all there. We know what we did. All right, drive safe. See you out there.